Hey everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we have a paid instructional video for Lands of the Mesozoic, which will be going up on a crowdfunding website in the very near future. Check the description below for all of the pertinent information about which crowdfunding website, when it's going up, the link, all that good stuff. It will be in the description as soon as all of that is available. Now, Lands of the Mesozoic is a 1 to 4 player game for ages 14 plus and plays within about 2 hours. I also want to remind you that, of course, everything you see here is technically pre-production. So while it is very good quality and may be close to production quality, anything is subject to change, as is the case with all crowdfunding projects. To begin setting up the game, first shuffle the Land, Herbivore, and Carnivore decks. Then place them in this order in the play area. Make sure that each deck has space next to it for a discard pile. Next, we'll create the period deck. This deck acts as a timer for the game and will produce different benefits or penalties for all players each round. First, separate and shuffle the first, second, and third periods, creating 3 small card stacks. Then shuffle the major Extinction event cards and place 1 on top of period 2 and period 3. The remaining major Extinction events will just be returned to the box. Finally, place the 3 periods on top of each other like this, creating a deck with period 1 on top, then period 2, and finally period 3 on the bottom. Now place this board and the period deck in the play area near the 3 main decks that we previously shuffled. Shuffle the goal cards and place 1 face up in the common goal area of the board. Now, each of the race goals should have a token value of 1 as well as a token value of 2 stacked up like this. Finally, put the turn tracker token on the arrow space of the turn track. The remaining victory point tokens can be placed in a supply near the board. The most ancient of your players will receive the active player token. Each player places their player board in front of them and collects 5 wooden cubes of the same color. Now, starting with the active player, each player draws 3 land cards, 2 herbivore cards, and 1 carnivore card. They also draw 2 goal cards. The player should not reveal any of these cards to other players. Then, each player chooses 1 goal card to keep and then will discard the other one. But make sure it's discarded face down. The discarded gold cards, as well as all of the ones still in the gold card deck, may be placed back in the box. And that's the setup. During their turn, players can play cards from their hands and or activate cards that they have already played onto their board. Additionally, once per turn, players can discard any 2 cards from their hand as a special action for a benefit of their choice. We'll discuss the special action shortly. There is no limit to how many cards a player can have in their hand. Cards that are in play may be used for their ability or to generate a resource to pay for another card. Using a card in play will usually exhaust the card like this, and usually it will stay that way until the next turn. Once a player cannot or does not want to play or activate any more cards, their turn will end. During the player's turn, anytime they draw a land, herbivore, or carnivore card, they can choose to draw it from either the top of the corresponding deck or the top of the discard pile. If the discard pile is empty, then they must draw it from the top of the deck. In the rare case that one of the decks is empty as well as its discard pile, as you can see here, there are no land cards, then players can instead draw from either of the other 2 decks, but they must draw from the deck, not from the discard pile. At the end of a player's turn, they will check to see if their ecosystem is sustainable, which we'll discuss in a little bit. But just keep in mind that if it is not, players will take an extinction action to restore balance. Then the active player will refresh all exhausted cards. Finally, the active player gives the active player token to the next player in turn order to indicate it's their turn. That player is now the active player. Land cards are the simplest of the 3 main types of cards. The cost to put them in play on the player board is to discard as many cards of any type from your hand as indicated in the cost. So here you've got 2, so you'd have to discard 2 cards from your hand in order to play the swamp to your board. Cards from your hand are always played exhausted. On the card itself, besides the cost here, you'll also find the ability of the card down here, if any, the card's attribute, its victory points, and of course, its name. Land cards will always have a cost of 1, 2, or 3, and they will all give you 0 victory points at the end of the game. If a land card is not exhausted, then it can be used in 2 possible ways. First, it can be used while paying the cost to play an Herbivore card, or the cost for the activation of certain abilities. So for instance, the swamp generates a wetland resource, and the Apatosaurus requires 2 wetland resources, so the swamp could be part of the cost for the Apatosaurus. The second way it can be used is to exhaust the card to use its ability, assuming it has one. In this case, it does. Remember that once exhausted, the card cannot be used again for any purpose until it is refreshed. However, exhausted cards can become extinct as a result of an ability, the special action, overgrazing, or major extinction events. This group of cards are the Herbivore Cards. Although the animals in this group are labeled as herbivores for simplicity, they actually represent the second trophic level of the food chain. Besides plant matter, some of the animals depicted may also eat invertebrates, fish, etc. Herbivore cards are relatively easy to obtain, but cannot be played until there are land cards already in play. Also, there's a limit on how many herbivore cards of each type you can have, small, medium, and large, and we'll discuss that limit shortly. Also, herbivore cards will have a combination for their cost of land as well as resources. The herbivore cards will have the cost here as usual, the ability down here as usual, but you can see here there is a secondary attribute as well as a regular attribute, and then the victory points will be found here. The size of the herbivore is found here. In this case, it's a large herbivore. Like land cards, there are 2 ways herbivores can be used. While paying the cost to play a carnivore card or the cost of an activation of certain card abilities, you can exhaust the herbivore card to generate a resource of its attribute. This herbivore generates a large herbivore resource. The second way you can use an herbivore is to exhaust it to use its ability, as you see here. It should be noted, though, that some herbivores will have abilities that do not require the exhaustion of the card. The abilities that do not require exhaustion are when played abilities, end of the period abilities, end of the game abilities, and active abilities. A when played ability is only triggered when the card is put into play from a player's hand, and after that the card is considered to not have an ability for any purpose. An end of period ability triggers at the end of all 3 periods, as long as the card is in play, of course. It does not trigger if it's in the Extinction stack pile. The ability should be resolved just before resolving major extinction events, or the final scoring at the end of the game. End of game abilities take effect at the end of the game, as you might expect, but this occurs during the final scoring phase. It doesn't matter if the card was in play or in the extinction pile at the end of the game, the ability will be applied regardless. Active abilities are effective at all times the card is in play, whether the card is exhausted or not. As I mentioned, herbivore cards have these secondary abilities here. These attributes are only used in the final scoring phase for goal scoring cards and end of game abilities at the end of the game. They have no effect during the game. Carnivore cards are the hardest to obtain. However, the abilities of most carnivore cards provide players with ways to gain victory point tokens. Also, carnivore cards are necessary to maintain a balanced ecosystem with more than 2 herbivore cards in play to avoid overgrazing. As with all other card types, carnivores interplay exhausted. The victory point symbol that you'll find in the ability of many of the carnivore cards will indicate how many victory points are gained by using that ability. The anatomy of a carnivore card is basically the same as an herbivore. Carnivores may also have when played, active, and end of period abilities. During a game of Lands of Mesozoic, players will draw and discard a lot of cards of all 3 types. When this happens, quickly check all 3 discard piles to make sure no cards have been misplaced in the incorrect discard pile, and then shuffle the discard pile of the empty deck to create a fresh deck, and then continue play. Earlier I mentioned the special action. The special action allows a player at any point during their turn, but only once per turn, to discard any 2 cards from their hand in order to draw, to land or 1 herbivore or 1 carnivore, or to make 1 card go extinct. If drawing from one of these decks, they can either draw from the deck itself or the discard pile as normal. If they choose to make a card go extinct, they take the target card and place it face down in their extinction pile. Cards in the extinction pile count towards the final scoring, but are out of play for any other purpose. So now let's discuss the ecosystem layout and its balance. At any given time during a game, players can only have up to 5 land cards in play. If players want to play another one, this can only be achieved by first making one of the current ones go extinct. Only up to 3 herbivore cards can be in play in the first round, and up to 4 in the second and third period, which is indicated by the period 1 indicators here and the period 2 indicator here. In order for herbivores to be in play, land cards must be in play first. Then, once herbivore cards are in play, carnivore cards may be played at the top of the ecosystem. There can only be 1 carnivore in period 1, 2 in period 2, and then 3 in period 3. Now, one thing that we haven't mentioned yet is the size indicators on these slots, which actually indicate what types of animals can exist in those slots. As you can see, there are no restrictions for the land. Any type of land can go in any slot. But there are restrictions on the number of specific types of herbivore and carnivores that can be in play at the same time. So this small herbivore is fine. This small one here is fine. This medium one here is fine. However, this medium could never have been played here as it's reserved specifically for a large herbivore. And so, for instance, perhaps this one could have been played there. And then let's check the top here. We have a large carnivore here, which never could have been played here. A small one here, that's fine. And a large one here, that's fine. So what could have happened instead is this small one could have been played here and this large one here, and now everything would be legal. During a turn, a card may never be played from a player's hand if it would cause that row to exceed the number of cards in the row below it. So this would be an illegal play. Additionally, at the end of a player's turn, if the number of cards in play in any row is the same as the number or higher than the row below it, a food chain imbalance is triggered. So here we have the same number of herbivores as we do lands, and so we have a food chain imbalance between the herbivores and the land. In the case of a food chain imbalance, 1 or more cards will have to go extinct until the balance is reestablished. Players can decide which cards go extinct, but they cannot make extinct more cards than is strictly necessary. So for instance, perhaps this card will go extinct. It's also irrelevant whether a card is exhausted or not. It can go extinct either way. If the number of herbivore cards in play minus the number of carnivore cards in play is more than 2, then a player will have to make one of their land cards go extinct from overgrazing. So for instance, here we have 4 herbivores minus 1 carnivore is 3, and so we have overgrazing occur. One of our land cards needs to go extinct. Maybe we make the lake go extinct. And now we have a food chain imbalance since the number of herbivores equals the number of lands. And so now an herbivore will have to go extinct as well. And maybe we do this one. At the end of the first and second periods, a major extinction event is triggered. At this point, if there are 1 or more cards, such as this one, with an end of period ability, resolve them now. You would then flip over the major extinction event in the period deck, and all players apply its effect. After applying the effects of the major extinction event card, all players then make land cards in play go extinct until there are only 3 or less left. So for instance, maybe the springs. This often will create a food chain imbalance, as you can see here, in which case it should be resolved immediately. This means that only up to 1 carnivore card, 2 herbivore cards, and 3 land cards in play will survive to the next period. Each player will have an individual goal card that will generate points at the end of the game. Additionally, the board in the middle of the playing area also has a goal card that is shared by all players. Each player scores points both from the common goal as well as their personal goal. Each goal gives victory points for each card played during the game that aligns with that goal. This includes both cards that are currently in play for the player as well as cards in their extinction pile. This board also has these 5 race goals. First player to achieve any of them will be able to put in a claim for the victory point token in the stack of that race goal. Although putting in a claim for the race goal will take place during the player's turn, the claim itself will not be resolved until the end of the round, and different players may claim the same goal in the same round. When a victory point token is removed, it reveals the lower point one beneath it, and the second player to achieve this goal receives that one. One player may not claim more than 1 token for the same goal. When a player fulfills the requirement of a race goal during their turn, they place one of their wooden tokens on the goal to put in a claim for it. At the end of the round, before moving the turn tracker token, that player will collect the victory point token at the top of the stack. If there are 2 or more new claims on the goal at the end of the same round, one player takes the victory point token at the top of the stack, and the rest of the tied players take an equivalent token from the supply. Leave these wooden tokens on the right side of the goal to indicate that the same player cannot claim any more tokens from that race goal. At the beginning of each round of play, the turn marker moves 1 space to the right. This allows the players to see how close they are to getting to a major extinction event. When the turn tracker reaches the final space, all cards in play go extinct into the extinction pile. Separate the cards by type and overlap them, leaving the rightmost part of all cards visible. Victory points from played cards are added up. These are the victory point symbols with the black background seen here on the right side of the card. Finally, players score victory points from their goal cards. The player with the most victory points wins the game. In the case of a tie, the player with the most leftover cards in hand wins. If players are still tied, the player with the most victory point tokens collected wins. If there is still a tie, all players share the victory, including those with lower victory points. And that's how you play Lands of the Mesozoic. Be sure to check this out if you're interested in it over on its crowdfunding campaign. Again, there is a link in the description below as well as all the pertinent information, so you can be sure to check that out while it's live. And until next time, if you're bored online, bored offline.